So first, tell us a bit about what's going on out of the courts in New York. Yes.
So the Attorney General of New York announced that his office is conducting an investigation of whether ExxonMobil misled shareholders in terms of many of the kinds of things which you just heard about here, and essentially a failure to disclose the risks of climate change and its impact on its business. So that, of course, got a big splash. It's actually interesting to digress for just a second in that the Attorney General of New York had also been investigating Peabody Energy, one of the world's largest coal companies, for failing to disclose information to its shareholders. So really looking at sort of the securities angle here and the duties. Peabody, basically, it came out in terms of the investigation of ExxonMobil, I think on Thursday or Friday, and by Monday, Peabody had said that it had settled with the New York Attorney General in terms of improving its disclosures. Not sure sort of where things are with ExxonMobil at the moment, but this again I think sort of shows how you can actually use innovative or interesting parts of the law such as securities laws, RICO, the Racketeering and Corrupt Organization Act to target these kinds of behaviors.
So that's a different approach than what they use with tobacco, yes?
The tobacco, there were aspects of the tobacco litigation that did turn on RICO as well.
Okay.
So,
that's really interesting.
and I think it's hard to say at this moment. There are a lot of discussions right now about the differences between, certainly this was about the similarities, but in terms of some of the differences as well. Something people are talking about right now too.
So the documentary also talked a bunch about how documents came out of the lawsuit. So there was a lot of discovery that went
Yes.
on. Are we optimistic that we might see something like that from the Exxon suit?
Well, a litigator's joy and pleasure and pain for anybody who's on the other side is actually when there is broad discovery. So discovery is the process of litigation or an investigation by which a company has to turn over, or anybody who's sued basically has to turn over all sorts of documents. One thing which might be interesting here is that because the New York Attorney General has been conducting this investigation, does it actually empower individual shareholders to file a request for sort of books and records? And whereas before a court might have thought that was a fishing expedition by a shareholder, the fact that the New York Attorney General has now decided to pursue this may actually make a judge more likely, should a case be brought to her or him, to let them sort of go forward with that. So parts of the investigation, of course, would be kept private, but it could be a lever to getting more information.
That's very exciting news. Bob, I wanted to ask you about the Energy and Enterprise Initiative. So we saw a scene in the movie where you were going to a radio station, I think a station that perhaps not many people here would be listening to. Sort of what share of your job is that sort of outreach, or sort of what does the Energy and Enterprise Initiative do?
We try to speak with conservatives about climate change, and so if I'm in an audience like that, or on a conservative talk radio show, which I think that's the Rush Limbaugh station, for example, that Mississippi station was, that's pay dirt for us. That's where we want to be, talking to that audience.
Do they invite you back?
I haven't been invited back by Paul Gallo. That's the guy that you saw me interacting with there, but we still got him on the undecided list. We great.
And so you find them there, or are you finding that you're turning hearts?
I think things are changing. And it's, again, we do great on a curve. I guess on earlier, Steve. But we think that the presidential race is actually coming off pretty nicely compared to what it could have been. If you think about, for example, 2012, Mitt Romney had a laugh line at the convention about climate change, remember? He said, Barack Obama wants to slow the rise of the oceans. The convention goes wild with laughter. And then he says, and I want to just help your families, and so he got great applause and everything. Well, I would say that nobody should be running for president and traipsing through South Carolina, particularly Columbia and Charleston right now, talking about or laughing about climate change. So we had 23 inches of rain in Columbia, and leafy neighborhoods were flooded. Not just poor people's houses. These were some very nice houses in Columbia, South Carolina, that are now people have no flood insurance and are having to rebuild it. So things have changed. That, but also just think about it. In 2010, for example, it was necessary to repeat the antagonistic, atheistic belief that we don't believe in climate change. If you didn't do that forcefully enough, people doubted your credentials as a conservative. Then in 2014, it became, I'm not a scientist, which is an agnostic position, which is a lot better than the atheistic position. We're making progress. And then comes John Cornyn recently writing a piece saying innovation is the key. Senator John Cornyn of Texas. And then comes four senators within the last 3 weeks announcing an effort, Senator Mark Kirk, Kelly Ayotte, Lindsey Graham, and Lamar Alexander, announcing a working group on climate and energy. That's pretty exciting. So we really are moving. Things are happening. But we're not there yet, obviously, but things are happening.
So I wanted to ask you about the sort of different strategies that you can use. There was the one in the movie where the radio host said something that was just false, and you get basically in a debate where we can just ask Siri and she'll tell us what the right answer is, that this is how many scientists believe this or no. You have events like the ones that you just mentioned in South Carolina, where you say, we see these things changing. And then you have the appeals that you've made to free market principles, to say this is really just enforcement of property rights, and to not do this is actually a great subsidy. Where do you see the greatest margins for response from the people you talk to?
Well, I should mention, by the way, one of the best events we ever did was here at the University of Chicago with you and Michael Greenstein on the what would Milton Friedman do about climate change. I mean, when we were able to show that to conservatives, it's powerful. What would Milton Friedman do about climate change? And you all answered the question. He didn't internalize the negative externalities, right? And so the question then is, can we get that into a digestible piece? I once said to a reporter at the Greenville News, we need to internalize the negative externalities. This is when I was still in Congress. He said, what did you say? So I repeated it, and he said, Bob, we can't put that in this paper, man. We write it at 7th grade level. I said, okay, reveal the hidden cost. He said, yeah, I can write that. And so we got to make it digestible, make it so that people can understand it. But the biggest challenge we have, though, is actually reaching into the conservative audience, because people self-select to come to an event like this, and then that's not necessarily the most conservative people. And so what we've got to find is, that's why I don't mind going, we got to find those audiences, so I don't mind being beaten on a talk radio show, because sometimes we win. So I was on a libertarian talk show host in Florida, or a talk radio show in Florida. The tease going in was awful. We got this guy coming up, wait for this, Well, the host extended into a second segment with me. And by the end of it, he was saying, I think you're right. We should have third-party financing of rooftop solar here in Florida. And why is that monopolistic power company fighting this? And so we were winning, making a libertarian argument, and we were making a libertarian argument on a libertarian radio show. And so I think if we can get to the audience, we can make the case, but we just got to make sure to get to that audience.
There was also the scene in the movie of you living the ice course, and that sort of being an aha moment? Well, now James Inhofe is the chairman of the Senate Committee on the Environment. Do you think he's too far round the bend for a moment like that?
Well, you know, we do great on the curve at Republican.org, and so Tim's not exactly the top of the class right now, but we're working on him. He's educable, I think. It's well, some people are hard to get, obviously, but you know, there are a lot of other members of Congress who are actually impacted by their kids. I'm looking at some students here. You have the ability, I think, to reach your parents. You're sort of the secret weapon at Thanksgiving, talking to Uncle Charlie, the one that's going to come, and he's going to be, you know, there's this bunch of hooey. You have the power to reach Charlie, or Grandpa. And so it's tough with Jim Inhofe, for sure. We don't write anybody off, but you know, what we do something different than the environmental left. The environmental left is very good at naming and shaming. And I've got to acknowledge that it works to some degree. It doesn't bring over the full involvement of the named and shamed. It does, however, cause them pain upon being named and shamed. So there's a discipline to it. But what we've got to do is we've got to give some sort of tribal protection. If you hear Michael Shermer is spot on. Has to do with Dan Kahan's research at Yale on this motivated cognition. Dan was one of my guests here at the Institute of Politics. It's really good research on that we've got to provide this tribal protection. And so that's what we're trying to do, is build a tribe out that can say we're for action, and we're conservatives, and look, we've got real faces, and we're real people. And by the way, if you want to join that, it's republicen.org. We'd love for you to post a picture of yourself and join that community. It's powerful because it will make it so that people, not so much like Jim Inhofe, but some others who want to act, maybe they're hearing from the kids, who maybe they're impacted by their nephew or whatever. They want to act, but they think that the activist won't support it. But if they see you on our site, and hundreds like you, they start saying, you know, this is real. These are real people that want real action on this. And some of them might be conservative.
All right, so we have a couple of microphones that we wanted to pass around and field a couple of questions from the audience.
My name is Paul Hoffman. I'm a master's student at Harris. I'm also a member of the Truman National Security Project. I'm an admirer of your work. The film The Burden, kind of talking about the national security implications of climate change. You see DOD kind of coming over to this side of the fence. We saw everything in the movies tonight. How close do you think we are to a tipping point? And having kind of, you know, what's a traditionally conservative part of the government, or, you know, DOD, coming over to seeing the implications of climate change. How far do you think we are from having other conservatives or other voices accepting that?
I think that it is a powerful message. This sounds counterintuitive, but it'll be stronger if a conservative wins in 2016. I know that's really strange, but I think that we're going to get more action out of a conservative White House than a liberal. Because at that point, the Pentagon really becomes a powerful voice. Right now, the thought is if you want that fourth star, you got to kowtow to whoever's in the White House. Well, if the White House is occupied by a guy that's related as conservative, and that fourth star didn't come to you because you kowtowed on climate change, it came to you because you were leading on it. It's a very different setup. So I know that sounds counterintuitive, but I really believe that, for example, if Mitt Romney had been elected, we would have been working on climate change right now, better than we're working now with Barack Obama. It's an odd thing, but I think it's really true. Bill Clinton was the only one that could sign welfare reform, and before that, Richard Nixon was the only one that could go to China. We don't trust people with their hair on fire to solve problems. We trust them to acquaint us with the fact that the building is on fire, but we look for reasonable, calm people to tell us where the exits are. And so, in other words, conservatives out there, don't lose hope. We have the opportunity to present a free enterprise solution to climate change and show that it's actually very consistent with what a whole bunch of progressives want to do, because the policy that we specifically propose is the same one that Al Gore's been working on for about 25 years. It's a revenue-neutral, border-adjustable carbon tax. Oh, I was supposed to say carbon tax, except here at the University of Chicago, with people like Steve and Michael, I can say it out loud, carbon tax. So.
Thank you so much for your work and commitment. By the way, Catherine Hayhoe is another person who, I don't know if she's conservative, but she's a religious person who has a really great impact. I think that the agricultural industries, especially the cattle industry, currently is about at the place where cigarettes were and other global warming, etc., is having a huge impact on the climate, and yet it's really being kept under cover. And I'm wondering if you could, I mean, not just on CO2, huge amounts of CO2, but many other things, soil degradation.
Methane.
Well, yeah, methane, of course, but soil degradation, water degradation, etc. Wonder if you could comment on that?
I guess I would just say that, I think I'd be very interested in your perspective too, just in terms of how the agriculture industry is thinking about climate change, because obviously there's going to be significant effects, and just as you look at the maps and look at the changes in growing zones, right? That where crops will be grown successfully or become unsuccessful will change over the coming decades. And that's just sort of the long-term trend, much less the issue of more severe storms and the impacts on crops. So, I guess I would like to believe that people in the agriculture industry are really on the front line of some of this, some of the impacts, and would therefore be motivated to be involved in this, as well as just questions about whether there are carbon sequestration opportunities involved in terms of how lands are stewarded and things like that. Obviously, I think a lot of the area where there's sort of crop agriculture tend to be more conservative areas, and so I don't know if you have any insights in terms of reaching out to those interesting communities.
For example, in December, I'm going to Montana to speak to a very large agricultural group. County Extension Agents is basically what it is. And they're very concerned about climate change. And these are very conservative people that are seeing the evidence and are ready to do something about it. So I think that, along with the national security angle, those things work. You're reaching new audiences. You're getting beyond, liberal elites at the coast. I mean, you got to get beyond that. And another way to get to them is people like Catherine Hayhoe. Catherine is a genuine article. She is a theological conservative and a political conservative. Many people operating in the faith frame in climate change are actually theologically liberal and politically liberal. Then going to a more Orthodox congregation is a little bit like me going into an Orthodox Jewish congregation and saying, "Hey, bros, I'm just like you." To which they would say, "No, we noticed at the door that you're not." So you got to go to people authentically. And Catherine Hayhoe, so we've got agriculture, we got Catherine Hayhoe reaching to people of faith, we got National Security Project reaching people in their own language, which is what's so crucial. We can't expect them to learn our language if we're telling a story to them. We got to say it in their language.
My question is, even if
you believe the battle, I guess in the long term, the rhetorical battle or strategic battle can be won to sway public support in favor of climate reforms or similar activities. Do you think the political landscape has changed to the extent that interests are simply far too powerful, what with money being considered political speech? I guess I'll point to the film pointed out the tobacco industry is a success story, albeit one that took 5 decades. But even a Philip Morris in his heyday, what is it compared to today's JP Morgan Chase fighting securities reform or today's ExxonMobil fighting environmental reform?
There's a rule in politics. It is basically don't try to kill your enemy because they'll fight like heck to stay alive, right? But I think there's an exception to that rule. And it's what I just did right here, for example. I just called in Uber, right? Because I got to get to the airport here soon. And if I were a medallion owner, I'd realize the Uber exception to the rule that I just stated, and that is, if you're incredibly better, which is what Uber is compared to medallions, right? The medallion owner has a, you can explain it in the economic terms, right? They get something of a monopoly, not a monopoly, but a guaranteed marketplace of some sort. Limit the supply, keep the price up, and then along comes Uber. And they're just incredibly better. And so what we've got to show is there's an incredibly better. And that's when it doesn't matter that you're trying to take out an enemy. That normally you don't try to do in politics, you just sort of try to rein them in a little bit. But in this case, I think we can follow the Uber exception, which is we can show a much better way here that gets improved economic performance and solves the environmental problem. And by the way, this is why we got to speak in excited terms like this. I believe if the environmental left, bless you if you're part of the environmental left, but please understand the eco-right needs to hear language of hope and optimism, and we can do it, by golly. If it's all doom and gloom and we're all going to die, and well then my people are just going to eat and drink and be merry if you keep on telling us we're going to all die. But if you tell us, you know what, we can make a lot of money off of this thing, we can create wealth, that's exciting, right?
Well, and I would caution people against saying these industries are totally monolithic. So yes, we have a lot of coal-fired power utilities in the country, right? But there's some which really are like Exelon, heavily invested in natural gas and in nuclear. So they actually have an interest in favor of climate regulation. And so these things can get disaggregated. You can have innovation. And so I would just be careful about creating these big monoliths, because I think that's actually disempowering as opposed to what are the opportunities for innovation, for finding allies, whether in the conservative side, if one's a liberal, or in terms of the business generation opportunities. A lot of technology companies are going to make a lot of money through this over time.
Michael was the last word.
All right, so for the last word, the young man in the back.
First, I want to thank both Mark and Professor Templeton and Congressman Inglis for their important work on this tough issue. Congressman Inglis, so I can see the version of the jailbreak in the Senate where one can get enough Republicans to kind of peel off, and as you pointed out, there's that little working group that started, and that's a certainly appealing sign, and that's partially being driven by electoral politics, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
I have a harder time seeing how that would work in the House with the current districts. I was surprised or a little taken aback in the movie because I should have known it, but I hadn't realized that your opponent in your last race was Trey Gowdy. He seems like he might be a challenging guy to bring around on this issue. So I wanted to just hear I can see the path in the Senate, but I'd like to hear your version of a path in the House. And then I know you're very short on time, so I'll just get out my question for Mark. Can you help us envision, so oftentimes things can happen to the courts that can't happen other ways. And so what's the mega version of the New York Attorney General's investigation on how deep could this go? What would the ultimate restrictions and penalties? Would they just be penalties for past behavior, or could there be restrictions that are broader than that?
Yeah, I think it's hard to it's hard to know without all of the facts, honestly, at this point in terms of how big it could get. I think that one of the issues that you have here is, I mean, I actually think that sort of the, have they misled shareholders is actually a pretty interesting angle to it, as opposed to, I think the damages for climate change and the companies having to pay for that is a bit harder of a road to hoe, just because of so many companies, so much time. How do you actually try to apportion responsibility for that? Not that something like that, a much smaller version was dealt with in some of the drug cases, but I just think that that's going to be particularly difficult. And so I think that you could see penalties, the companies having to pay fines under the Act for misleading shareholders and things like that. It's just a little unclear at this point, because they were sort of playing both sides of the fence, how it would actually play out.
Yeah, on the first question, yes, it's a little bit easier in the Senate than in the House for sure, because the House, we have this sorting going on. Part of it is by gerrymandering of districts, but the other part is the effect of people choosing to flock with birds of a feather. So if you're sort of a small government kind of guy or lady, you sort of end up in Texas, and with all these other people that feel the same way, right? And so that sorting is impacting our drawing of districts. And you're right, Michael, that politics are driving of course, Mark Kirk's interest in doing this. It's fun to be here for a screening at the University of Chicago, because you are all over this film. Did you notice? I mean, you got the guy at the bike shop that got his PhD here. You got Heart Lane Institute on Walker Drive.
Hey, that's not the university.
Yeah, exactly. You got the Chicago Tribune doing the flame retardant thing. I mean, this film is all about Chicago, apparently. And but yeah, it's reaching into. I think that we've got to go at these very red districts. I know some people would think, Inglis, you've lost your ever-loving mind, man. Why are you down there in Mississippi talking on that radio station? But our view is, we think we're going to get NPR listening Republicans that center and toward the Tea Party fence, but we won't get the Tea Party. But we need to message across the Tea Party fence to them. Because by messaging that way, you create a broader piece of a tribe that can be for you. And so that's why we message high-octane conservatism, in the hopes that it gives tribal protection for more on the spectrum. If you aim just at the midpoint, all you get is sort of mushy middle. You don't get anybody being able to go home for Thanksgiving and say, you bet I'm for that thing. And you bet I'm a real conservative from the University of Chicago Department of Economics. And so that's what we want to equip, especially your students, to go home this Thanksgiving and say, you bet that's what I'm learning in Steve Sakala's classes or Michael Greenstone's classes,
All right, on that note, thank you very much for coming.
Thanks.